Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are and which time zone around the world. Welcome to the opening press conference of the ITF Virtual Summit 2021. My name is Michael Kloth, I'm the head of communications of ITF, and I welcome you to the largest ministerial gathering in the world, which is taking online this year to the theme of transport innovation for sustainable development. And the subtitle we've given it is Reshaping Mobility in the Wake of COVID-19. Apologies. I'm delighted to have with me Minister Eamon Ryan of Ireland. He's the Minister of Environment, Climate, Communications and Transport. And Ireland is the presidency country of the International Transport Forum this year. So Minister Ryan will be presiding over the summit and also chairing the ministerial meeting, which is the highlight of our event. Also with me is Secretary General Young Tae Kim of the International Transport Forum, and both the Minister and the Secretary General will speak to us in a minute. Let me just tell you that this event will fall into three different phases. The first one is the Minister and the Secretary General giving the short speeches. The second one is the presentation of the International Transport Forum's Transport Outlook 2021. This is our flagship publication, and my colleague Jari Kaupila will present the findings to you. And then thirdly, we will have a Q&A where you come in, you can ask questions, and I encourage you to do that from the get-go via the Q&A function in the portal that you've logged onto. So we can already start to prepare some pertinent answers for you. Without further ado, I would like to invite Minister Ryan to give his remarks.
Michael, good morning, and good morning from Dublin, and good afternoon or good evening to everyone around the world who are joining us at this special moment. And it's my pleasure on behalf of the Irish Presidency to welcome you to the 2021 International Transport Forum Annual Summit. The COVID pandemic has caused such disruption across the transport sector for the last year, presented real difficulties, real challenges, which are ongoing. However, it's also provided us, I suppose, an opportunity to re-examine how and why we travel, and to envision a more resilient, sustainable, efficient and equitable transport sector. We'd all hoped to be there in Leipzig for these 2 weeks, but I'm confident that this virtual summit will present other opportunities. And I think it's particularly appropriate that it brings us together to look in a new way to engage in this summit on the theme of innovation for sustainable development, reshaping mobility in the wake of COVID-19. That is the opportunity we have to deliver out of this crisis. The summit will also give us a chance to look at the other key challenges we're facing today and the opportunities provided by innovations in technology, in policy design, which will be crucial as allowing us to travel safely and efficiently into the future. I'm looking forward to the Council of Ministers meeting next week, and hope we can all come together to support the ministerial declaration, which will set out our shared vision for the transport sector and demonstrate our reaffirmed commitment to harness transport innovations and to build back better from COVID-19 while ensuring a sustainable recovery. I believe the summit will also offer us the opportunity to demonstrate strong leadership on climate action. And I look forward to participating in the ministerial roundtable on transport and climate. The meeting offers us an opportunity to come together and discuss how we can cooperate to ensure we enhance ambition on climate action. It's particularly important this year as we go into the 5th anniversary review of the Paris Climate Agreement, which hopefully in November this year in Glasgow in COP26, we will commit collectively in transport and in every other sector to enhance our climate ambition. As well as the ministerial sessions, I'm looking forward to the wide range of networking events, panel sessions and side events right through the summit programme. If I can, just being parochial, one side event I want to promote, if I can, is the Greener Path, a people-centred approach to a sustainable island, which has been hosted by my own Department of Transport, the Irish Department, and its agency Transport Infrastructure Ireland. It's looking at how we implement a people-centred approach to sustainable mobility and decarbonising transport, which includes speakers not just from our own transport agencies, but also from the New Zealand Ministry of Transport, as an example of the international cooperation that this event can provide, where we share best practice and experience in making the change. That innovation, that getting it right, requires a firm evidence base. And therefore, I think one of the really important elements we have to discuss in these next 2 weeks is ITF's Transport Outlook 2021, which we'll hear about just more in a moment. It provides exactly that evidence-based. The 2021 edition of the Outlook focuses on the impact of COVID-19 on the transport sector and models the potential long-term changes which may arise due to the pandemic. It also examines the role that population and demographic changes will play in shaping future demand. Crucially, the Outlook also models transport decarbonisation scenarios and their impacts on climate change. And it highlights not only the impact different policies have on emissions, but also their social and distributional impacts. So by doing this Transport Outlook 2021, it sets out the decisions which we as policymakers will have to take today as we do a just transition in the way we deliver social mobility. So I'm looking forward to all the various events. I hope you are too. And I hand back now, Mike, to my colleagues in the ITF Secretariat and look forward to what will be no doubt a very fruitful and engaging 2 weeks. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ryan, for laying out the program that the Irish presidency is putting on for us. Who wants to hear Mr. Ryan speak with a little more time can join us for the opening plenary right after this press conference. And it's now my very great pleasure to bring to you the Secretary General of the International Transport Forum, Young-Tae Kim, who's actually with me in this small studio. And I hand over to him. Young-Tae, the floor is yours.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for logging in. My name is Young-Tae Kim. I'm the Secretary General of the International Transport Forum. First of all, let me salute Minister Ryan. I thank him for the extraordinary work he and his team have done over 2 years of an extended ITF presidency. Ireland has led our organization through difficult times with skill and with grace. Gurev Mela Magat. With this press conference, we kick off the ITF's 2021 Virtual Summit. As an online event, this summit remains the largest meeting of transport ministers in the world. We have 60 ministers, vice ministers, and heads of organization participating as of today. I'm particularly delighted to welcome among us the new member countries that joined the ITF last year: Uzbekistan, Mongolia, and the observer country, Brazil. The ITF Summit is more than a gathering of ministers. It's the world's premier transport policy event. It is the place for a global conversation about the future of transport and mobility. A conversation among political decision makers, business leaders, major international organizations, top NGOs, and the best researchers. As of this morning, over 1,600 participants representing 81 countries are attending. Many stakeholders offer side events, host virtual exhibition stands, or participate in the pre-summit research day. Usually we do this over 3 long and intense days in the beautiful city of Leipzig, which we sorely miss. For our virtual Leipzig this year, we have spread the program over 2 weeks. The topics we will discuss range across the entire sector. The focus will be on the buzzwords in our summit title: innovation, sustainability, and COVID-19. Let me start with COVID-19. The pandemic has put transport in an unprecedented dilemma. Transport activity had to be massively curtailed to contain the virus. But functioning transportation is also critical to fighting COVID-19. Essential staff must get to work. Vital goods must be delivered. The economic costs of winding down mobility are horrendous. So are the costs of maintaining operations under the conditions of a pandemic. COVID-19 has also forced behavior changes that many thought impossible and that pose fundamental questions. This much is clear. As we leave the pandemic behind us, transport cannot just aim to recover. It will need to reshape. This takes me to sustainability. Transport must act quickly and become a part of the solution to the climate crisis. Its carbon footprint continues to grow, while other sectors have managed to turn around. We will hear the latest projections for future transport CO2 emissions in a few minutes. Transport does not need to be a laggard in decarbonization. It has all the potential to be a leader. That is why the central theme of this summit is innovation. Innovation is not the only answer, but a big part of it. We need technological breakthroughs, but we need more than that. We need innovation all around. We need new and radical thinking to create transformative business models, revolutionary governance frameworks, unthought of forms of collaboration. Innovative ideas can make transport an engine of sustainable economic development. Innovative ideas will give citizens better access and open up new opportunities for them. Not least, innovation ideas will help make transport cost-effective and profitable again. Reshaping transport will be a massive effort, but worth it. Today, we released the ITF Transport Outlook 2021. It shows where the choices we make today will take us over the next 30 years. Its findings provide a solid scientific basis for our deliberations. Let us use the next 2 weeks to help set transport on the right track for the future. The time for the great transport transformation is now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yante. Thank you for these words. We now come to the second part of our press conference, and that is the presentation of the publication that you've already heard a little bit about. And my colleague Jari Kaupila, who's the head of quantitative policy analysis and foresight, whose unit has produced this report, will be taking us through it. It is published every 2 years. It's based on the best modeling around. It covers all transport all around the world. It's the ITF Transport Outlook.
Thank you, Michael. Minister Ryan, Secretary General. It is a great pleasure to introduce the new ITF Transport Outlook 2021. It presents long-term projections for transport demand and related CO2 emissions under alternative policy scenarios. These scenarios are based on ITF's in-house models covering all modes of transport, freight and passenger, globally, nationally, and at city level. For us at the ITF, Outlook is really a strategic tool. It helps us to analyze how the world could change if we choose different policies and different development paths. Today, more than ever, there really is need for such analysis. The COVID-19 pandemic has dramatically affected our daily lives and challenged the way we work, travel, and live. At the same time, pandemic has highlighted the critical role the transport sector plays to ensure functioning of our societies. Now recovery has started, but how the pandemic will change the mobility of people and goods over the longer term is still very much uncertain. This edition of Outlook has a specific focus on the impacts of COVID-19 on transport, providing answers to that question. But we must not lose sight of our vision for transport future, economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable transport. The policy scenarios presented in this report are designed to understand what role public policy can play in designing the future transport system. So for us, the ITF, the Outlook is a discussion starter. At the same time, it is call for action to reshape mobility in the wake of COVID-19. So what are the key facts coming from the ITF Transport Outlook? First, global demand for transport will more than double by 2050, both for freight and passenger transport. This actually is a lower projection from our previous outlook in 2019, reflecting new policy commitments on decarbonization and also less optimistic economic projections even before COVID-19. COVID-19 brought transport demand to a halt, but only temporarily. We see traffic already at pre-pandemic levels. Population and economic growth, especially in emerging economies, will drive the growth in transport demand. This means that even if all announced climate policies are put in place, CO2 emissions will grow by 16% by 2050. Any progress towards low carbon mobility is more than offset by the increased demand for mobility. This also means overshooting the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 3 times. The current decarbonization policies are simply not ambitious enough globally to meet climate goals set in the Paris Agreement. We see a strong correlation between regions that generate the highest GDP per capita and the individual per capita CO2 footprint. But the good news here is that these are also the world regions with the capital and technological means to take a leading role in reducing CO2 emissions. However, more ambitious decarbonizing policies, together with well-targeted economic stimulus packages, would bring the climate goals of the Paris Agreement within reach faster and with more certainty. Ambitious policies can cut transport CO2 emissions by nearly 70% by 2050, according to our pathway. To arrive at that future, we have identified 6 top priorities for policymakers. First off, we need to raise ambition to reverse CO2 emission growth. The revision of the nationally determined contributions this year offers an opportunity to set ambitious targets and identify clear actions for the transport sector. As I said, we have identified a pathway that allows us to meet the carbon targets that is in the slide, the reshape scenario. If we further front load and leverage opportunities during the pandemic recovery, we can meet these objectives sooner and with more certainty. That is why we also need to align policies to revive the economy, combat climate change, and strengthen the social cohesion of our societies. Global inequality has increased in many areas. First, income distribution is widening. We see this around the world. CO2 emissions are also unequally distributed, with low-income countries often suffering the most of the climate consequences. In the transport itself, many of the vulnerable groups, young, old, have worse access to opportunities such as jobs, schools, or healthcare than those who are better or well off. And the COVID-19 pandemic has really further aggravated this situation. So aligning policies for decarbonization, economic recovery, and inclusion will be the most cost-effective. It will gain public support and it helps us to achieve our goals faster. One of the most important ways to align these goals is to move from mobility-focused policies to accessibility-focused policies. A policy focus on accessibility centers on people having access to opportunities without putting the emphasis on traveling more or faster. This policy will enable users to choose the most effective mode or route for the purpose of the trip, individual trips, with focus on sharing of assets, both in passenger and freight transport. Each sector needs, however, specific strategies. Urban transport has the greatest potential for decarbonization through electrification, shorter travel distances, availability of non-motorized options, and public transport. For long-distance passenger transport, solutions must be different. For example, where no alternative modes exist, alternative aviation fuels are needed. For freight transport, low-carbon technologies will need to be boosted together with scaling up of already existing measures, such as digitalization, standardization, and consolidation, sharing of assets. We don't have yet all the technological breakthroughs we will need to decarbonize the sector. So what we need to do is to invest in developing new fuels and vehicles that are affordable and available quickly. We also need to encourage the adoption of these new solutions by providing financial incentives and invest, for example, in public charging infrastructure. It is important to target first shared and high-use vehicle fleets, such as delivery vehicles, buses, shared mobility services. This way, we can really reap the most benefit compared to private cars. Finally, I can't stress enough on the importance of optimizing the use of existing assets. This is critical. But transport sector cannot succeed alone. We need collaboration between all sectors. Electric cars will only be emissions-free if the electricity production is emissions-free. On the other hand, tourism and trade can only become sustainable with sustainable transport. So we are all in this together. We have to break silos and also work together. Thank you very much. This was a very short introduction to the highlights of the Outlook. All key data and projections are available through direct links in the publication itself and also will be made available on ITF website.
Thank you very much, Jari. And here I am in a slightly different room, so I can have a chat with Jari and COVID-19 compatible rules. Thank you so much for that presentation. Very, very interesting. I've read parts of the Outlook, but it's always good to hear it kind of in this very concise, pithy way. If you have questions to Jari, please start to post them now. And I'm delighted to introduce also two colleagues who've worked massively on the Outlook. Malithi Fernando, who's a policy analyst and the project lead on the Outlook, and Luis Martinez, who's our lead modeler and who's done all the number crunching that is behind all the words that you read. So maybe I can just throw out a first question to Jari while you're all typing your queries into the chat. And that's a little bit, Jari, comparing the 2020 Outlook to the previous edition, 2019. Those of us who remember that will perhaps also recall that the projections for the growth of transport demand was somewhat higher. So I wonder, can you explain to us a little bit why those have been revised downwards?
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. So as I mentioned very briefly in the presentation, in the 2019 Outlook, our projections for transport demand were to triple by 2050. And now we are at the range of 2.3 for passenger, 2.6 for freight. This is really driven by, I would say, three major issues. The first is lower than before economic projections. Already pre-pandemic, there were some projections that were really put lower than that. And as we know, economic growth drives also transport demand growth. And so this is one of the factors. The second one is that since the 2019 edition, countries have put in place more ambitious climate targets, which have also then the potential of reduced transport demand by shortening trips, and moving to other modes, more active mobility for short trips, etc. So there's that impact that we take into account in our baseline scenario, if you wish, in our recover scenario as such. And the third one is the COVID-19. We have incorporated some of the impacts from the COVID-19, increased teleworking, perhaps increased video conferencing, and in some part, shortening of supply chains in response to resilience, that all have an impact. But to be very fair on that, this is very uncertain. We do not know yet the long-term impacts of COVID-19. And in the Outlook, we are providing alternative scenarios for that to help us to scope what is the final potential impact on demand of those type of features.
Thanks, Jari. And I have a question here from Agustina Calatiud, who poses a very interesting one, namely, could you please tell me more about the projections for emerging economies? And that is one of the things that you mentioned in your presentation, Jari. Maybe this is a question for Luis, I think. If we look at the emerging economies and the developed ones, how do they differ? Where do they converge? If we look at them separately, what are the most poignant points that we get out of the models that we run?
Thank you, Michael. I would say that we see a slow convergence of the CO2 intensity per CO2 per inhabitant of more developing countries and developed countries. And currently, as Jari mentioned, developing countries with a very slow burden on the CO2 account. They were taking sometimes part of the consequences. This is difficult that some of the developing countries, most of the developing countries in Asia and Latin America and in Africa, they converge also on using more advance in the technological pathway, but also on the organizational pathway, taking advantage of some measures that are more on the organizational side on how to increase efficiency by better use of resources.
Thanks, Luis. A question that maybe links in quite well with that is about public transport. In emerging economies, populations rely much more on public transport than in developed countries, and PT has been one of the main victims of the pandemic, of course. But then we needed to make transport more sustainable. Malithi, how do you see what future do you foresee based on the numbers that we have for public transport post-pandemic?
Thanks, Michael. Certainly, public transport will remain a very key component of a sustainable, what we call a multimodal transport system, where people can use an appropriate type of travel, whether it's by active travel, public transport, private car, to achieve to go where they need to go. And so after the pandemic, it's extremely crucial that public transport continues to and has an increased support from authorities. We have seen that the pandemic has exposed some perhaps shortcomings and risks in the way that public transport is financed and funded. An over-reliance on fares may not reflect the very unique benefits that public transport provides. Environmentally speaking, it is one of the most efficient ways of moving large numbers of people. It is the backbone, as I said, of a sustainable transport system, and we see that in our modeling results. And from a social perspective, as you mentioned, in many countries and many groups of people in every country, they rely on public transport as their main, if not only, form of transport for accessing jobs, participating in the economy, going to school, doing their shopping. So it is extremely important that we maintain support for it. There is apprehension, of course, after COVID, and so I'm not lightening or I'm not making this seem like a easy task, but it is imperative that public transport does not lose more ridership as a result of the pandemic in the long term, because it will certainly threaten our ability to meet sustainable transport goals. Just to mention, there are other financing options and funding that we mentioned in the publication. This might look like differences, creative revenue streams, whether that's using transit-oriented development and capturing that extra land value that you've now given to the development in the area of public transport stations, and also shifting spending priority away from private car related spending and infrastructure to active modes, public transport, the kinds of modes that we want to really build up and have a strong alternative to private cars.
Thanks, Melisi. And that kind of brings me from public transport to another transport mode that's been severely hit by the pandemic, which is aviation. And this may be a question for Jari. Aviation is notoriously difficult to decarbonize, and the options that are being floated are electrification or bioF fuels. Will we really see electric planes, aircraft flying around? What does the outlook have to say on the aviation future?
This is obviously still very much a new area for development in the industry, but in the outlook itself, we do project and we do model that the electrification would take place in the aviation industry starting from 2030, specifically for the hybrid electric aircrafts for distances around 700 to 1,000 kilometer flights, and for full electric planes, perhaps a little bit later on a shorter distances such as 300 kilometers. This is really driven by the recent technological improvements in engine development and battery capacities, and that has led to several industry players already to start looking at electric planes. And again, we do see a potential there, but for more short distance travel as well.
Thanks. Now, I'm going to mention one more mode, and I'm not going to go through all the different modes, but it's an interesting question. Micromobility. Luis, what is the future? We see all these electric scooters in our cities, and sometimes it's controversial. Some cities ban them, some love them. What is the future for micromobility and urban mobility?
Yes, thank you, Michael. It's a very interesting question because I think the short term and the long term of micromobility might be a little bit different. While currently micromobility is perceived more as a recreational element of mobility and not being so much as a origin to destination mode for daily use. Micromobility in the future may become a very relevant element for access, to replacing private car mobility, also for short trips, complement the access for public transport and other types of travel. And I think it will be part of a very important access element of urban mobility, and it will be more as a form of a package, as a mobility as a service that we will provide you as an alternative tool for a specific trip. Then what we have in the future is to target much more the mode usage with the purpose, which currently we have normally use the same mode for all purposes. What we'll have in the future is try to target much more the correct mode for the correct use.
Let me ask you a question that was posed by Nathaniel Tan, and he's asking, is there a possibility for anything between the recover and the reshape scenario, given that the ambitious policies seem a little impossible, while the recover policies are not enough? Is there a third way? I don't know who wants to answer that. Maybe Jari.
I may start to say, I hope there isn't. I hope there is the ambition really enough to get to the reshape and even to the reshape plus scenario. We see the significant impacts of the climate change on our lives, on the transportation system itself. And without that ambition, we will be locked in a future that is simply not where this planet needs to go. So we do have a pathway available that allows us to get to the reshape scenario. And again, starting from the revision of the nationally determined contributions, moving from the ambition to real action in those by setting up clear targets for the transportation sector. We reviewed the NDCs a couple of years ago, the previous ones that were posted, and only 10% of NDCs have a specific target for transportation sector. So there's a lot to be done, and starting from the simple facts, like setting up a target and using then policies that have been identified already, that are available and are possible to implement. Again, I think the social equity implications of all these policies are extremely important for actually implementing these policies so that we can ensure there's a public support for those policies as well.
Can I ask maybe all three of you can tell me what they think about this. What are the main hurdles, the constraints, what hampers the implementation of this policy? So the Outlook gives these 6 recommendations and they're very clear, but there are obstacles, of course. What are they, and what do policymakers need to do to overcome them? Maybe start with Malithi, but I'd be quite happy to hear all of you.
Sure, thanks, Michael. So we do mention in the Outlook, and as Jari presented as well just now, the importance of moving from accessibility-focused policies to from mobility-focused policies to accessibility-focused policies. And what we mean by that is that people are not traveling for the sake of traveling. It is travel demand that results in these CO2 emissions. And so if we want to reduce emissions, we need to reduce demand. And that is not possible if people are forced to travel long distances to get to the destinations that they need, to get healthcare, to get food, work, whatnot. So one obstacle that I would that I foresee is unsustainable development patterns or sprawling city growth, for example. The entire world is urbanizing quite rapidly, especially in some regions. And so as these new cities develop, as existing cities grow, if we continue to build in a way that focuses on private car travel, and we build these long distances and low densities, we're going to really set ourselves up for a much more difficult time in shifting people to cleaner modes, in running public transport efficiently in these low density areas. And even beyond transport, it is much more expensive for cities to service utilities and other municipal services with these development patterns. So I would say that the location of destinations that people want to get to, any sort of unsustainable development patterns in that, I think will harm sustainable transport.
And Luis, what is your main obstacle that you see?
Yes, thank you, Michael. I agree with Malithi, but I would say that one additional element is the certainty on investments. We know, as Jari mentioned, that we'll have a lot of investments to do, either in technological developments and implementation of electrification, either the fleets, but also creating the grid and the charging locations that will provide the cleaning of our mobility without harming too much the demand. And this is very important if we give certainty to the vehicle developers and also the grid that this will be there, and we have already also regulation or certainty on investments. I think it's quite relevant for achieving this goal.
And Jari,
I would add to those 2 points, public opinion and public acceptance of the policies that we need to implement. We've seen over and over again around the world, the difficulty of changing taxation, adding congestion charges, making these major changes that do have potential negative impacts for the users of today's transportation system. And I think there are 2 ways of going about that. The first one is being better in communicating about the benefits of these new policies, who and how it will benefit. And of course, for that, you need robust data, you need good assessments on the impacts of the policy so that the public really understands who will be targeted and what will be the impacts. And that way you can have a informed discussion about that. I think the second one is providing alternatives. So if we are charging infrastructure, we need to provide an alternative for that charging, better public transport options available for the users, and so on and so forth, so that there's an option, and all those policies are not seen as a penalty, but as improvement to the transport system that we have today.
Very good point. Actually, Malithi's answer tied in quite well with the questions that's come in from Sandy Fong, who asks on whether you have any comment on how actually to change the appraisal of transport initiatives from mobility to accessibility. I mean, it's, you know, it's an obvious point that if you get to the hospital on a shorter distance, you travel less, you know, then everyone benefits. You're quicker, and the environment has less CO2 to deal with. But how do you actually plug that into the planning and the appraisal system?
That is a very good question, and one that I don't think there's a neat answer for, but the current appraisal of our transport investments, they do focus very strongly on travel time savings. And these travel time savings often come with more mobility-focused policies. Those are the ones to have wider roads, less congestion, have people travel faster. And what we do know about this is that travel time savings typically benefit people who are already have very high accessibility. They are people that typically are driving cars and are not necessarily in lower income groups, and who may be forced to use public transport. So right now, I would say that we are very focused on mobility in traditional transport appraisal. Moving away from that, we'll need to proportionally put more emphasis on the social and environmental impacts. There are a number of changes that are coming in. I mean, every country has their own appraisal system, but there are developments to try and better reflect environmental and social and health benefits as well. Health benefits that come from having cleaner air and less air pollution that you can't necessarily have if you have large highways everywhere. So I believe it's a shift in emphasis. So right now, moving from about 85% of the benefit that is calculated in appraisals from travel time savings to and kind of lowering that emphasis and reprioritizing for the health, social, and environmental benefits.
Luis, in one of his previous answers, alluded to something which I would like to tease out a little more, and that is the electricity grid, electrification. I mean, you know, it seems like a lot of the sustainability effort is going towards electrification of all kinds of transport, from scooters, where one actually could ask oneself whether it makes sense, to planes. But clearly we can only have clean transport with electricity if the electricity that is provided is produced in a clean way. So is the answer maybe not at all within the transport system, but do we need to kind of find ways to collaborate more with the energy sector, and how do we do that?
Yes, thank you, Michael. I think it's dual. Okay, from the decarbonization perspective, electrification will really play a key role, because it will allow us to get in the pathway without, of course, relying on the cleaning on the grid. But even if we deal with the same grid, just having an electric engine and not a combustion engine, we have already a saving of 50%, even with the same grid. It's important to say this, although of course to have a few potential of introducing the electrification, we might rely on a clean grid that allows us to fully use the potential of the system. The thing is, it's a double, because we cannot forget that sustainability is much more than emissions, and we have to provide access for people to opportunities, to jobs, as Maliti was saying, and also not creating the other externalities that mobility also generate. Then if we create just electric vehicles and use exactly the same patterns of mobility that we have currently, and not reducing the other impacts of the usage of the vehicle, like cars that we just use 50 minutes per day in average around the world, and we create a huge number of resources unused, we may still have a sustainable problem then we have to have a little bit more of a holistic approach to the problem that is not just purely just emissions, but also a more sustainable approach to mobility.
And if I may, Michael, add to that, and to add on what Louis is saying, give an example, just a very simple example. Electric congestion is still a congestion. So we cannot only look at one solution at a time.
Yeah. Again, something was mentioned that we should touch upon, which is shared mobility. So at the end of the day, it's about capacity. It's about sharing available resources in a more efficient way. So put 4 people into a car rather than one, and maybe also have a car that doesn't weigh 2.5 tons to move a person that weighs 60 kilos. But in practice, shared mobility has encountered difficulty. Often it's sort of not so much a capacity improvement, but just higher flexibility, which is not a bad thing. So maybe a question to all of you again: how do you see shared mobility in all its forms developing in the post-COVID world?
If I can start, Mike, I would say that shared mobility, it's a very large and vast concept, and I think we have to tailor it down a little bit. Also, what is the shared mobility that will give or lead into an increase in load factor, or a better use of resources, as we were mentioning. Then if we create a shared mobility solution that even reduces load factor, because it has a lot of empty kilometers and it has a very low party sizes of persons in the same vehicle, this shared mobility may even create additional vehicle kilometers traveled. If we create shared mobility solutions that normally even they are linked more into developing countries where they are used already to use these solutions, where load factors are significantly higher and provides at the same time the flexibility, but also higher vehicle usage. This is the shared mobility that will even create a solution that bridges the private mobility to the public transport and give also the access and cooperate with public transport towards a more sustainable and accessible solutions in urban contexts.
I'm sure the others have also views on Meliti.
Sure. I can add to what Luis has already spoken about. One other aspect of this kind of shared model versus the private car ownership model is that we're not trying to get rid of cars completely. They have a role in, I mean, there are certain trips that you need a car for. You can't necessarily do on bike. And so the idea with shared mobility is, as Luis mentioned, to bridge the difference between a private car and public transport. You still have the flexibility, but you can serve the needs of the entire, population with a smaller fleet of vehicles. And if you have a smaller fleet of vehicles, you also use up less urban, or well, not just urban, just space in general. And there's a certain cost of, associated with, saving room for plenty of parking or roads and whatnot. So there is also kind of a social benefit of using less fewer vehicles to meet the needs of your population.
And that's certainly true. But one question I have, and maybe Yari is in place to answer that, is COVID-19 not threatening kind of all of that? Is there not a thing in the world that is basically undermining, pulling the rug, that's not a very good analogy, underneath shared mobility, because it's just running counter to what people at the moment feel they need to do for their own safety?
If I may, just to start at least, I think this is a real challenge, as was talked before about the situation with public transport. Any mode that is bringing a lot of people together, COVID-19 obviously has an impact, as people are perhaps afraid of using these modes of transport. But I think we also have a vision for the future through the vaccinations that are really moving ahead. We do also see a lot of the transport actors, the operators, putting in place very strict sanitary rules for public transport, for shared vehicles, etc. Many of you have taken shared vehicles. You do see that. And very encouraging studies have shown that it's actually very limited number of cases that get infected in the public transport system or in the shared vehicles. So I think it's first of all about the creating a trust to the system and the trust that the pandemic is over. And during the previous pandemics, the SARS pandemic and others, we did see a dip in the usage of some of the flights and the public transport. But at the end of the day, these have been continued growing since then. So I do think that many of us don't have even another option. So public transport, shared vehicles are going to be crucial. Just on the use of the shared vehicles in the future, you asked, Michael, one really key area could be where we could see shared mobility increase is in emerging economies, developing economies, where you have informal public transport already in a similar system. Formalizing that into formal shared mobility is definitely one way forward. The other one where we see already also in developed economies, countries are looking at using some type of on-demand shared mobility services, minibuses or others, to replace let's say low demand, low density routes that are still under the public service obligation, that you do have to maintain that mobility, but running a big bus on that type of a service is perhaps not the most cost effective. So having more on-demand type of shared mobility service for feeder service is another concrete area going forward.
It's 10 to 1. We have time for maybe 2 questions, maybe 3, depending on how big topics they are. One has just come in, and that focuses on something which I found very interesting when I read the Outlook. One of the figures that really struck me was that actually 60% of all passenger transport is not urban. It's outside of urban cities. We talk a lot about cities and they're very much in focus. It's like, urbanization and all of this, but actually 60% of passenger transport is outside cities. So the question that I have here is, what is the best course of action for people living in regional areas where they're less served by public transport and EV infrastructure is not available? How can they help to meet the climate goals if they're willing to, but the region is just not there in terms of the infrastructure? Who wants to take this one? Maybe Melissa.
Sorry, Michael, was that me?
If you want.
Yes. Well, it is true. So when we look at travel outside of cities, we call it regional or intercity travel. Regional travel happens between rural areas or between rural areas and cities, and the other is intercity transport, which includes your flying and rail connections and road connections between cities. This regional sector is definitely one of the most challenging in terms of demand management, which means trying to shorten travel distances or avoid travel where necessary or where possible. So one of the biggest messages to come out of our analysis for this regional transport sector is that the importance of moving to cleaner vehicles and providing incentives and subsidies where necessary to make them more affordable, as they are fairly expensive compared to other options as they currently stand. We also need investment in public charging infrastructure, especially for these longer distances outside of cities. Right now, it is difficult for people to choose EVs, for example, without the confidence that they'll be able to charge their vehicle at wherever they go. So we do recommend investing in charging infrastructure, as especially coming out of this pandemic. So yeah, that's one of the main findings to come out of this outlook for specifically that regional travel sector.
I'm going to ask a methodological question to Luis, who is the numbers guy, the modeler, because I think that would be interesting to many of our listeners. Why is the ITF transport model, which is actually several models, people say, I've heard it, I can vouch for it, is the best? What are we doing that others models aren't doing?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mark. I think I don't know if it's the best, but we try to stay at the state of the art and improving it in every publication. What is the main difference on the models? Also, because we try to modelize all the mobility really that happens around the world. Normally, what we have is very sophisticated but very tailored models around the world. This has been the tradition in the transport sector. There are more accurate models on urban activity. Normally, sometimes not for the long-term projections, or yes. And the thing is, our approach has been global and trying to foresight and into the future. And this has been one of the unique features that we try to incorporate. And this is not just a work alone of ITF, because we have a lot of partners that we work with also to have result in our model that rely on some that on population projections, GDP projections, the environmental or the fleets projection that we also have within the OECD family. And all this work together is, I think the unique feature is the availability of data, the models and the scope that is global and foresight for the long term.
If I may add one or two more things, what I think is also unique, is that we really, as we focus, starting point for us is demand projections. We look at what is the demand for transport in the future. And then the second stage for us is to look at how different policies will affect that demand. And that policy simulation, if you wish, it is sort of a living tool where you can simulate the impact of several different policies in isolations or together by region, by at the city level, by global level, and see how they will affect demand, but also how they will affect mode choice. And of course, as a result of that, CO2 emissions, local pollutants, and equity and accessibility, as we're trying to really do in this edition of the Outlook.
Great. We have 4 more minutes, so we need to come to an end. And I'll ask one question to all three of you, ask you to give a short answer. The summit is about innovation, transport innovation. So what is the one transport innovation you think that will do the most to get us to sustainable transport sooner rather than later? Malithi.
In short, I think it would be moving away from this private ownership model to shared mobility and car sharing. So yes, I'll leave it at that, moving away from focusing on private cars.
I know it's a challenge, but thanks. Luis.
Yes, I think it's also data. It's also more awareness of our externalities on our mobility. I think most of the people are not aware on the externality they generate when they move every day.
And I'll break the rule. I say two things. I say technology innovations for alternative fuels, but I think the other one, going to what Malithi said as well, is innovations that allow us to increase the average load of every vehicle, every movement that we have. So increasing the average load of vehicles, both for passenger and freight.
Great. Thank you all very much, all three, Malithi, Luis, Jari, for your time. Thank you all who joined us online here in the portal or via YouTube. If you still have questions, send them to us via email, chat to us during the summit. You can also come back tomorrow. We have a full day of Outlook, where we'll look a little bit into the sort of sectoral aspects of urban mobility, of regional transport, of freight. We haven't talked a lot about freight here, so that's maybe something. And there's also a kind of more high-level discussion plenary. The whole day is about Outlook. We have all the sessions planned twice so that all time zones can participate whenever it's convenient for them. So if you found this appetizing, then please come back tomorrow and ask more questions. And now, if you have nothing better to do, you should switch over to the opening plenary, where you can hear the US Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, Secretary Pete, and Alina Valea, the EU Commissioner for Transport, and the UK Minister, Grant Shapps, the German Minister, Andreas Scheuer, in the opening plenary panel. Thank you so much for being with us. I hope you enjoyed it. I did. And we'll see you again tomorrow or in the opening plenary. Thanks very much, and bye-bye.